I'll give you all a few minutes to join, and then we will get started. People are starting to come in already. So here it is, a beautiful, sunny, chilly morning here in central Ohio. This is going to be a fun panel, a plenary panel devoted, featuring, I want to say, the women of Ohio, primarily. It's interesting to have a whole panel of women from Ohio and near adjacent states like Kentucky, who we consider to be part of our region. I don't think we can really claim Virginia as part of our region, but we will start in a few minutes with Yvonne Howell, who will introduce our plenary panel. I want to remind you, I'm Angela Brintlinger. I am the director of the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, though this morning I am in my living room in Yellow Springs, halfway between Columbus and Oxford, Ohio, where Hannah is in her office, I think. We are delighted to be able to host the Midwest Slavic Conference again this year in a slightly odd format. It's not even hybrid now that the word hybrid has been readopted to mean other things, but we're trying to combine Zoom meetings and blog posts and presentations live and not live over the next 2 days. So thank you so much for joining us. Many of you were with us last night with our keynote speaker, Yvonne Howell from the University of Richmond, who today I think is not at the University of Richmond, but is indeed in her home.
Yes.
So what we'll do is we'll start with Yvonne, who will introduce the panel. Afterwards, she will give some questions to the panelists, and then Alicia Baca, who is our outreach coordinator at the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, will give you a little how-to for the Q&A, and then we would love to entertain all kinds of questions from the audience. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Eileen Kunkler, Assistant Director of the Center, and Alicia Baca, who have done so much work to make Midwest Slavic happen this year. You don't get to see them so much. Now they've gone back to being black squares on your screen, but we are so grateful for their hard work basically all year to make this happen. So let me pass the baton or the microphone or whatever we're using to you, Yvonne.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I want to really compliment Angela Brintlinger on persuading all these marvelous people to be here. This panel you are about to hear just it looks marvelous. It's going to be great. I'm going to introduce the three speakers in the order that they will be speaking. And here goes. So our first speaker will be Hannah Chapman. Hannah is the Karen and Adid Dawisha Assistant Professor of Political Science at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Hannah hesitated about whether she had any contribution to make related to happiness in Eastern Europe, mentioning that a colleague once described her work as, quote, why people have warm fuzzies about dictators. But that in and of itself is why I want to hear your talk, because that's just marvelous. Of course, Angela, is persuasive. We all know that. So when Angela insisted that even talking about happiness in our regional context does not imply that we will achieve it, Hannah did agree that she could definitely contribute to a discussion about the delusion of happiness. So Hannah holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin and has studied both Russian and Kazakh languages. She is the author of numerous articles, including recent ones on xenophobia and xenophobic attitudes in Russia, and on the intelligibility and definition of democracy. She is currently working on foreign media broadcasts as a tool of soft power, as well as a book project entitled Shoring Up Autocracy, Participatory Technologies and Regime Support in Putin's Russia. Dr. Chapman's topic today is manufacturing consent, the politics of showmanship in Putin's Russia. So that will be our first talk. And correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three speakers, right? So following Dr. Chapman's talk, we have Smokey Musarai, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, as well as author of the book Tales from Alvarado, Ponzi Logics of Accumulation in Post-Socialist Albania, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2020. So Smokey is currently working on a book chapter about different imaginaries of the material of concrete in the urban landscape in Albania. So she looks at, among other things, ideas about the good life, hence happiness. So we are going to hear a talk entitled Temporalities of Concrete, Housing Imaginaries at the Margins of Europe. I should say that Smokey holds a PhD in anthropology from the New School for Social Research, and has published numerous articles relating to pyramid schemes, pyramid firms, and corruption in Albania. And our final third speaker is Karen Patron, the director of the Cooperative for the Humanities and Social Sciences and professor of history at University of Kentucky. I hate to admit this, but I just did a quick little, bit of extra research on Karen, and I want to say this is one extremely popular history professor at the University of Kentucky. Her primary research interests include cultural history, gender history, propaganda, war and memory, and the history of subjectivity and everyday life, especially in Russia and the Soviet Union. Her books, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, include Life Has Become More Joyous, Comrades, Celebrations in the Time of Stalin. That was her book from 2000. The Great War in Russian Memory from 2011. And she's currently working on a manuscript entitled Reading War Memory in Putin's Russia, also for Indiana University Press. And I think many of you are probably familiar with her 2015 edited volume, Everyday Life in Russia, Past and Present. So Dr. Karen Patron will speak today on the topic of war memory as entertainment, because we are still kind of grasping for this theme of happiness. War memory as entertainment in 21st century Russia. So those are our three panelists, and we will get started with Hannah Chapman.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Yvonne, for the introduction. Give me a moment and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So as Yvonne mentioned, when Angela first invited me to give this talk, I was really hesitant. My work really doesn't lend itself on its face to this concept of happiness. I study pretty much how autocrats attempt to manipulate public opinion, which really doesn't bring up ideas of happiness, at least to me. But Angela, as Yvonne said, is very persuasive. And she wrote back to me and said, you know what, Hannah, in our region, we really oftentimes end up speaking about delusions of happiness rather than the dingus itself, if happiness can be a dingus. So today we're going to focus on this idea of delusion, or more specifically, how autocrats disguise politics as entertainment in order to try to build up their public image and, importantly, try to improve satisfaction with the regime. So over the course of his now 20+ year rule, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been really quite a savvy user of this combination of entertainments with politics. So to give you some examples, there is his primetime television show called Moscow, Kremlin, Putin. Perhaps more aptly should be called Keeping Up with the Kremlin. That promises original, never before seen footage, giving an exclusive look into Putin's daily life and work. Or if you watch a lot of Russian TV like I do, the very popular press conference that he gives, So rather than being kind of the very serious thing, we think of a press conference with journalists. Instead, you see journalists vying for his attention, holding up everything from stuffed animals to my personal favorite, this placard of Putin as Superman. And perhaps the most well-known example of this entertainment, politics as entertainment strategy, the Direct Line with Vladimir Putin, which is an annual call-in show that I'm going to talk about today. So one of the struggles that pretty much all governments, but particularly non-democracies face, is how to persuade people to actually pay attention to the government's message without sacrificing control of the political conversation itself. And so by disguising politics as entertainment, the Kremlin is seeking to boost Putin's image and popularity, and to do so, importantly, in a way that encourages people to actively tune in and listen to the regime's message. But the question then becomes, and this is really where I am interested in looking in, is does it actually work? That is, are these strategies successful in developing a delusion of happiness and bolstering individuals' satisfaction with the regime and with their own place in the political process? And so this is the question that I tackle in my book, and which I'm going to illustrate today through this case of the Direct Line. So the Direct Line with Vladimir Putin, as I just mentioned, is an annual call-in program in which the president has direct contact with ordinary citizens and addresses their particular concerns or worries or problems, frequently making policy recommendations and promising action to address issues that are raised during the course of the broadcast. So the Direct Line began way back in 2001 and has continued pretty much annually to this day, except for a couple of exceptions, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. And so this program, it has its roots in the Soviet complaint system and even farther back in the Russian Empire's practice of petitioning the Tsar. But today, the Direct Line is one of the biggest and most popular television events in Russia. So in its very first year of the program, about 70% of the population said that they watched at least some of the broadcast. And this figure is actually quite astonishing, especially since it takes place in the middle of a work day for the majority of the country. While viewership has gone down quite a bit in recent years as it's become more routinized, so I ran a survey in about 2016 where I asked people who watched it, and only about 45% said that they watched the whole broadcast. But still, and this is quite a large portion of the population. So to kind of put it in context, Putin's speech to the Federal Assembly, his other big address of the year, typically pulls in viewership of everywhere from around 8 to at the maximum 25%. So the Direct Line is over double that. Moreover, the Direct Line has actually been named one of the most important events in the world in particular years by Russians, beating out at various times Brexit, the World Cup, and Russia's parliamentary election. And even as viewership has gone down over the years, the number of questions that are allegedly asked during the broadcast has increased quite a bit, from less than 500,000 at its first year to consistently over 2 and even bumping up over 3 million questions. So for weeks prior to the broadcast, every news channel advertises the Direct Line, encouraging people to call in for the chance to speak with Putin. Go ahead, make a call, Maria Satel, one of the hosts, encourages people. You still have time. Maybe it is your question that Vladimir Putin will answer. And so this game show-like quality is a way to try to increase interest and excitement in this program, and to encourage people both to submit questions and then to tune into the broadcast in case they are one of the lucky few to actually talk directly with the president. So in part, the Direct Line's popularity can be attributed to this idea of spectacle and showmanship. Unlike a lot of most political events or speeches, the Direct Line is carefully staged and scripted as a game show where people who play have a chance to win direct access to the president. And even people who choose not to actually call in or participate in any way still can experience this sense of spontaneity. So you never really know who's going to be showing up on the broadcast, whether it's Nikita Mikhalkov, Alexei Kudrin, or maybe even Edward Snowden, or whether Putin will be asked for a dog from a caller or for the state of Alaska. So there's always kind of this sense of spontaneity. And so while this direct line program has a lot of the elements of a game show, at its core, it is meant to kind of control the political conversation and as a way to manage Putin's political image. And I'm going to talk about a couple of ways that it goes about trying to manage Putin's image to the public. The first of these is to try to position Putin as a listener. From the very first broadcast, Putin has advertised explicitly the direct line as a form of dialogue and feedback with the people, a chance for people to actually have their voices be heard. So throughout the broadcast, organizers will remind people to call in because don't forget, Putin is listening and ready to hear their concerns. Indeed, when I asked people in a series of surveys what they thought the purpose of the direct line was, a plurality of individuals said that they thought the purpose of the direct line is for the government to actually learn about their concerns, the concerns of everyday Russians. So the first thing this broadcast does is try to pitch to the people that Putin is there and is listening to them. The second way that it tries to manage Putin's image is to present him as a problem solver. So he's not just listening to people, but he's actually going out and solving people's problems and making the country better for them. So frequently during the direct line, Putin will direct specific concerns to appropriate authorities, ordering that, don't worry, this will be done. Or even will actually have problems solved during the course of the broadcast itself. In one now infamous example from 2016, a woman in Omsk actually brought up an issue about there being potholes in her city. Before the show concluded, one of the moderators announced new plans that have been made to repair the roads. And social media posts just hours after the broadcast inferred that construction had already begun. So this left photo here you see is of a tweet just a couple of hours after a broadcast showing construction on roads in Omsk with the tweet saying, you don't believe, but this is Omsk right now. On the right is an image that circulated in the weeks after this on Kontakte and various social media that shows two pictures, one of Omsk before the direct line broadcast and one of the city afterwards, showing a comical level of development. So messages such as these are meant to enforce the idea that Putin is a strong, empathetic leader who actually cares for his people and is the only person capable of running this country. The point is to present a facade or a delusion, one might say, of responsiveness, of Putin in particular listening to people's needs. So, but my question, and the question I always kind of get to when I see these types of things is, do people buy into this? Do they actually believe the message? Are they seeing, as Putin explicitly advertises, the direct line as a form of voice, as a way for them to have their concerns be heard? Or, on the other hand, is it simply dismissed as yet another form of propaganda that has little bearing on how people actually view the state? Do people see this and just dismiss it out of hand? And so this is what I am going to try to answer in the rest of the talk today. So I try to get at this question through what's called an information priming experiments. So the purpose of these types of experiments, and I promise I won't spend long on the methodology here, is to bring some piece of information to the forefront of people's minds before asking them their opinion on a variety of issues, things that we care about. So I conducted these experiments and I embedded them into nationally representative surveys that I conducted through the Levada Analytical Center. And in them, I brought up the direct line, just mentioned its existence, to half of my respondents before asking everybody about two different things. First off, what are their views of Putin, their approval levels? And then furthermore, kind of trying to dig into this idea of voice is, do they actually think that the government cares and listens to people's opinions? And so the idea here is that if this tool is actually effective at influencing political attitudes, the people who were primed with the information about the direct line are going to express higher levels of approval and perceptions of voice than those who were not. So don't want to leave you all in suspense. What I found is that for the most part, it does actually appear to be working. On average, simply mentioning the direct line improves approval for Putin by about 4 percentage points, and perceptions of voice by around 3 percentage points, although this isn't quite up to conventional levels of statistical significance. So what these results say is that simply hearing about and knowing about the direct line does actually seem to improve satisfaction with the government. And so at first, this seems like really excellent news for the Kremlin, right? Political technologists seem to have come up with something that is working at making people have, these warm fuzzies towards Putin and the government, and that the mere existence can actually bolster views of the regime. But I want to return to this graph that I showed you a little bit earlier. So as you can see, while some people do actually think that the purpose of this program is for the government to learn about their concerns, or vice versa, for the government to tell people about what's going on, there's actually a pretty large portion of the respondents who think that it is simply a way to try to bolster Putin's approval ratings. And moreover, this figure is growing over time. So as you can see, this third part of the graph here, it is boosted. This level is boosted up quite a bit from 2015 to 2016. And this is something that I found a lot in the interviews that I conducted. Some people, like Maxime here on the left of your screen, really do think that this is a way for the president to hear about problems from the source and to really have some type of virtual immediacy, some type of contact between the president and the people. Others, as Andre says over here, really do dismiss this as, look, this is just a performance. This is just a way to try to make people like Putin, and it doesn't work for people like me. I'm too savvy to buy into this. So what we see here is kind of a split in the population, with some people appearing to buy into it and some people not. And so what I hypothesize is that there is going to be this split due to essentially individuals' political sophistication. So if people are interested in politics, if they participate in politics in some ways, as well as what we call political priors. Essentially, just do they have pre-existing pro-regime views or anti-regime views? And so in this little kind of stylized world that I have created here, I argue that it is split into two groups. One, the believers, who, when they are primed with information about the direct line, I call these participatory technologies in the book, and those who have low levels of political sophistication, who are trusting of the regime, these are the people in particular who are going to be most likely to be positively affected by the direct line. On the other hand, we have these skeptics, people who are more politically savvy, or who come into this really not trusting the regime at all. And for these, I expect, this is probably like Andre, they're not going to buy into it. We're not going to see a difference in public opinion. And so I want to walk you through some of these results. So what I have here is a graph called marginal effects. Don't worry, I'll walk you through this. So the line here in the middle, if there's any overlap with the line, means that there is no impact of the direct line on, here I'm showing you perceptions of voice for these particular groups. If it's to the right of the line, it means we're good. There is a positive effect. To the left of the line, it means there's a negative effect. And so for these believers, as I call them, the people with lower levels of sophistication, people who say that they trust Putin, it does appear to be explicitly working for these particular individuals. It is specifically these groups that are the ones that express more positive opinions of the government and of this perceptions of voice idea when they are reminded about the direct line. What's interesting is these critics. So what I expected going into this is that people are going to see this and they're just going to be like, look, this is another type of propaganda. We see this all the time. I'm too savvy to buy into it, so I'm just going to dismiss it and move on with my life. And that does seem to be the case for these people with higher levels of political sophistication. They kind of just dismiss it from their calculus, and there's no evidence that being primed with the direct line sways public opinion. But for these critics of the regime, the people that go into this kind of not really buying into government's message, they don't really dismiss this. but rather when they are primed, when they are reminded about these strategies of politics as entertainment, they actually express more negative opinions of the government. So not only do these politics and entertainment strategies fail to improve views of the regime among skeptics, they can actually backfire and strengthen existing negative opinions, ultimately leading to this kind of split, this political polarization. So when I fielded my experiments, 5, 6 years ago in 2015 and 2016, this negative effect wasn't really going to be worrying that much. Of my samples, less than 10% fell into this kind of critical group. But that figure is growing over time. And moreover, I went back and did more interviews in 2019. And something I found growing in this is that people are getting really, really tired of this over time. As the direct line has been going on for over 20 years now, and nothing seems to be improving. Right? So this direct line is supposed to be here trying to improve perceptions of Putin as being a problem solver and a listener, but people are seeing the same questions addressed year after year after year with little remedy. So as discontent with the direct line grows, as people are seeing that nothing is really coming of it, and the government fails to give instructions that these are more than just a delusion, that they are actually effective, the efficacy of the direct line and other politics as entertainment strategies as a tool for manufacturing consent and improving happiness or satisfaction with the regime is going to wane. So I will leave it at that, and I look forward to having a conversation.
I will unmute my audio long enough to hand over the mic or whatever it is to our next presenter, who is Smoky Musarai. And thank you, Hannah. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Hannah. I'm gonna share my screen, and please bear with me. I hope this works. We had some issues, but hopefully this is gonna be okay. Okay, so my presentation is entitled Temporalities of Concrete, Housing Imageries of the Post-Communist City. I keep changing the ending of this title because you could talk about Albania in Tirana and Saranda, the two cities I'm going to talk about in very different ways. I will start talking about one event that I attended in 2015. So in summer of 2016, the main topic of public debate in Albania, in Tirana, the capital of Albania, was the construction of a playground. At the day of inauguration, which was June 1st, which is a national holiday, it's the Children's Day, throngs of children and adults descended upon the new playground, eager to experience the new structure that had been subject to much public debate. Alongside the children and their families were also groups of protesters who had engaged in opposition to the construction of the playground for months leading up to the inauguration. This heightened attention to a playground speaks to the ubiquity and importance of construction and urban development in public discourse in millennial Albania. This would be the first significant public works project by the newly elected mayor, Erion Veliaj, a hip young man who had studied in the United States and who had worked in civil society and who was representing a new generation of uncorrupt politicians. Veliaj had campaigned on a platform that promised më shumë gjelbërim, më pak betonizim, which translates as more greenery and less betonizim, which means concretization from the word concrete. It's hard to translate it, so I'm going to refer to it as betonizim. Veliaj targeted the unregulated and intense construction that had plagued the city since the 90s and the lack of public investment in the deteriorating infrastructure. Instead, he promised the rehabilitation of public spaces taken over by new housing developments. These were concerns shared widely by Tirana residents. Yet, a year after Veliaj's landslide election, many lamented that this first project of his went counter to these earlier promises. Rather than adding green space, the playground entailed the pouring of concrete on the only protected green space of the city. Civil society groups engaged in an ongoing protest that took the form of Occupy movement, with some of the protesters camping near the construction site for weeks leading to the inauguration. But unlike the Occupy movements around the world, the protesters in Albania did not share the anti-globalization or anti-neoliberalism ideology. Rather, the main slogan was that of anti-betonism, as you can see in this photo. Over the last few years, the idiom of anti-betonism has become a dominant form of political critique in Albania. Laments about betonism built upon historically and culturally specific meanings associated with the material of concrete, beton. Indeed, concrete is a material that has often served as an icon of different ideological discourses in Albania, from that of modernity and progress, and to that of authoritarianism, decay, and stagnation. In this presentation, I explored the changing quali-signs and temporalities of concrete in Albanian construction and public discourse from the communist period to the post-communist period. I focus on state-led projects and public protests against these projects. In these instances, praise or lament or concrete and concretization speak to contested visions of the present and the future in cities that continue to be post-communist in their design, in their materiality, and their collective memories. So very briefly, by quali-signs, I'm borrowing here from the work of Christina Ferravari's work on concrete apartments in Hungary. So by quali-signs, I refer to meanings and sentiments and affects that are attached to specific materialities. And by temporality, I refer to specific orientations towards the past, present, and future. And I borrow here from historian Reinhard Koselleck, who defines horizons of expectations as expressed in official and vernacular discourses around construction. So I distinguish three temporalities that are expressed in different times by different groups. One is that of a revolutionary temporality, which is expressed, which I note in the construction of concrete panel apartments in the early communist period. Another is a temporality of a restorative nostalgia, a term by Svetlana Boehm, which characterizes the urban redevelopment project in 2000s, and more specifically, I'll talk about one project that was a coloring of these old buildings in Tirana. And then the third is a temporality of endurance, which characterizes the discourses of anti-betonism and efforts of preserving and restoring older buildings in the cities in Albania. In communist ideology, the material environment was key to shaping and potentially transforming society and the individual. A lot has been written about this philosophy of materiality, and here I'm specifically interested in how this ideology advocated change in the material environment as a means of shaping the good life of the future and the individual. Prefabricated apartments, for instance, were meant to transform human experience and social life. The material of concrete became a preferred material in the construction of mass housing in both East and West, and concrete was the preferred material of communist construction in particular, because it promised the efficient, modern, durable, affordable housing for the working classes. In Albania, mass prefabricated housing came later, but it quickly became a standard for new housing development. Initially, it was actually suggested by Nikita Khrushchev. So we have a connection with the Soviet history and Soviet ties. And it was suggested as a rational and efficient way to produce more housing. The material of concrete in the panel apartment buildings became state mandated even after the break of the Soviet Union in 1961. Concrete apartment buildings embodied a modernist temporality that entailed a break from the past. Concrete was promoted as a material of a different, better, transformative time. The modernist temporality, according to Elidor Mahili, entailed new values and attitudes such as the ethic of frugality, rationality, and modesty. Specific quali-signs of concrete, such as the grayness, functionality, durability, and simplicity, were praised as qualities of communist ideology and culture. By the late 1980s, however, prefabricated apartment buildings became an icon of a failed modernity, of missing the train towards the future, partly because they were built on the cheap in Albania in particular, lacking, for instance, insulation, which was not the case in other Eastern European countries, and partly also because of the lack of upkeep, which followed the economic decline of the late 70s and 80s. And yet, despite the disdain for concrete, since the 90s, we have seen several engagements with the communist constructions that take on contested meanings and temporalities of concrete in the post-communist landscape. So one example of this such engagement is an urban renewal project spearheaded by former mayor of Tirana, Diorama, who is now the prime minister. And this project was dubbed Return to Identity. And it sought to reclaim public spaces occupied by kiosks of the 90s and illegal constructions. And also it painted in bright colors government and residential buildings from both the pre-war era and the communist era. This urban renewal project generated a lot of buzz internationally, and Rama won the world's best mayor award thanks to it. In a TEDx talk that described the project, Rama relays a confrontation that he had with a European representative in Tirana at the time who had opposed the choice of colors. So here is Rama quoted from the TEDx talk. So I said to him, the European representative, no, I'm sorry, compromise in colors is gray, and we have enough gray to last us a lifetime. So it's time for change. The rehabilitation of public space revived the feeling of belonging to the city that had been lost. So here, I want to pay attention to the temporality that he is evoking. On one hand, we notice that Rama is framing this project as a break from the past. Yet at the same time, he also describes this initiative as an effort at restoring a city that has been lost. So even the title of the project, Return to Identity, evokes a temporality of restorative nostalgia. In Svetlana Boehm's work, who talks about different kinds of nostalgias, and in her reflections of various urban projects in post-communist cities, restorative nostalgia is the kind of nostalgia that conveys a temporality that looks back into the past and attempts to restore it in a utopian form, covering up the flaws and defects of the bygone era. As a point of comparison, similar restorative projects have happened across Eastern Europe and across the former Soviet world. For instance, in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, the communist era apartment buildings have been given new limestone facades that, according to Bruce Grant, recalled the townhouses of fin de siècle oil barons. So in the Azerbaijani context, the restoration of the facades seemed to reach back for a pre-communist utopia, namely the oil boom era prior to Azerbaijan's annexation into the USSR. But in post-communist Albania, Rama's return to identity restored the pre-war as well as the communist era layout and buildings of the city. So concrete continues to endure in the post-communist era as a material, as an aesthetic, as a discourse. Prefabricated apartment buildings are still standing and house many people. Concrete as a material is still used widely in construction for the same reason that it was used during communism: cheapness, functionality, etc. Further, perhaps more unexpectedly, the aesthetics of bare concrete have also had a comeback in both state-led projects and private construction. So Edi Rama, who I mentioned earlier, the former mayor, current prime minister, has had a sort of 180 turnaround on his feelings about the concrete. His own house, private house, built at the outskirts of Tirana, is built in exposed concrete. Rama described his house boastfully. In this house, this is a house built entirely with the material of concrete. There's no plaster, no drywalls, no beams. So that was his description of his house. The house evokes images of concrete bunkers, which are another staple of Albanian landscape that continue to dot the Albanian landscape to this day. And they're a remnant of communism as well. Similarly, European design and architectural firms praise the avant-garde aesthetic of concrete. Thus, designs for new towers in downtown Tirana feature the gray and boxy aesthetics of concrete. And I'm referring here to the building on the left of the screen. So this building, the TID or tower, which is also Hotel Plaza, features the gray and boxy sort of square aesthetics of concrete. but it's featuring it here as a symbol of European cool or European avant-garde. The firm, which was a Belgian boutique firm, design firm 51N4E, described the design of the hotel as a simple shape which fully captures the Mediterranean light of Tirana. So here we see this sort of recasting of concrete as a material of the future, but that also captures something about Albanian's Mediterranean-ness. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes. By contrast to these avant-garde reappropriations of concrete, in popular discourse, concrete continues to hold negative connotations. Urban residents, public intellectuals, and opposition politicians use the idiom of betonizm, which I mentioned at the beginning, to critique the form that urban development has taken shape in Albania since the 90s. This discourse of betonizm reflects their experience and horizon of expectations of 21st century Albania, which are shaped by rapid urban expansion, the intensification of the city, and the neoliberalization of urban space, public space. For one, the discourse of betonizm laments the disappearance of public space. And second, it tackles environmental anxieties about air pollution, air circulation, and the encroachment of concrete over nature. This is an image of Saranda, another city I'm going to talk about. Saranda is also a case in point for the environmental critique of betonizm. Saranda is built on a hillside. It's a smaller town. It's by the sea, next to the border with Greece. And it slopes down to the bay on the Ionian Sea. The urban geography of the city is shaped by the white stone of the hill and the aqua blue sea. The residents of Saranda are very much attuned to these natural features as key aspects of the good life, the good Mediterranean life. The intensification of the city, or betonizm, according to these residents, has encroached above these natural elements of the city. For instance, in the damp, hot summers months, which is when I conducted my research, residents of Saranda lamented nuk qarkullon ajri. The air does not circulate. The late architect Max Velo, in a book that is entitled The Betonizm of Democracy, reflects on Saranda's history, and he captures these critiques of betonizm that I encountered again and again on the ground. So he writes, for the first time I came to Saranda in 1957. Saranda was a wonderful thing. It was maintained, it had an ordered scaling, it had a very good urban plan. It had wide stairs that went uphill, and you could see the mountain when walking up and the sea when walking down. Everything was evenly distributed through the veins of the city, all the way to each house. There was freedom and air currents. Now everything is blocked. There is total blockage and urban clots. The city cannot breathe. This idea that the city cannot breathe is actually a narrative that I encountered also in Tirana. So in these laments, beton and betonizm stand for the destruction of the Mediterranean city that builds upon symbiosis of natural elements such as the breeze, the views, the natural stone, the sea, and open public spaces, the stairways, the boardwalk by the sea. These claims to the Mediterranean city, I argue, invoke a horizon of expectations characterized by an enduring temporality that transcends Albania's tumultuous history of the 20th century. The idealized imagery of the Mediterranean city circumvents the failed communist modernity as well as the messianic neoliberal modernity of the post-communist period. Instead, architect Velo, Saranda's residents, and protesters in Tirana and Saranda want to stop the further betonizm of the city. In these critiques and protests, a different vision of the city and the future emerges. This is a vision that preserves the present, whether it is preserving historical buildings such as the National Theater in Tirana, which unfortunately actually was demolished during the pandemic, but people protested around it for 2 years. And the opposition, or also the more balanced rapport between nature and urban build, such as was the case in the playground protest, and the opposition of construction in Saranda. So I describe these actions altogether as a temporality of endurance because they are not looking at the past. They're contrast with other contemporary engagements with the concrete, such as the restorative nostalgia of Return to Identity project or the new messianic temporality of avant-garde European aesthetics of towers. Local laments and protests against betonism hold beton as a symbol of the destruction and stifling of the city, the disappearance of public space, the encroachment of concrete over green space, and the blockage of airflows. And another aspect that I did not discuss here is the suffocating presence of corruption, which is people see as connected to betonism. The critique of betonism expresses disappointment and disillusionment with the current state of affairs. To echo some of the themes from yesterday's presentation, imaginaries of this Mediterranean city are also imaginaries of hope, of the possibility of the good life that can be generated precisely through the reconfiguration of the city and the urban building, right? So through the preservation of urban form that exists and through, of course, other interventions that people want the city to make. So one thing that I noticed that is sort of as a final point that also connects these various temporalities of quasi-signs of concrete over time and across different groups is that despite the contested meanings and temporalities of concrete, one theme runs along these different engagements, and that is a deep sense of horizons of expectations that tie happiness to the transformation of the built environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Smokey. I think happiness is tied to the buildings in our environment. So we will have some questions and discussion about that. Okay, and our final panelist in this marvelous trilogy is Karen Petran.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank Angela Brittlinger for the invitation to participate, and also the staff of the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Ohio State. So thank you very much. Last night, I found very compelling in Ivan's keynote the argument that Alex Dubas's work is a counter-narrative to a Putin-era national identity based on suffering and Russian exceptionalism. My analysis is complementary in that it explores how Putin's official patriotic culture seeks to inspire moments of happiness to strengthen the affective bonds of the Russian people to the state. And it works actually also with the papers today, because I'm asking Hannah's question. I'd like to ask Hannah's question. I don't really have any answers, but I'm asking the question anyway. Is this working? You know, does this work? And also following in Smokey's paper, I'm very interested in issues of temporality, because I do think that temporality is absolutely key to what's going on. All right. So while it seems quite incongruous that remembrance of the great patriotic war of the fatherland, which cost the Soviet Union 27 million lives, could be associated with joyful entertainment, it turns out that this is a common phenomenon in contemporary Russia through such phenomena as blockbuster films, as Steve has written, video and computer games, historical reenactments, multimedia museum displays, and the particular topic of today's talk, three-dimensional panoramas. In the last 20 years, the Russian state has made great efforts to make patriotism both appealing and emotionally satisfying through patriotic culture that doubles as entertainment. I investigate three-dimensional war panoramas to explore connections between war memory, entertainment, and attempts to create joyful affective attachments to the contemporary Russian nation. And I have more questions than answers on this. It's a very open-ended talk. While the intensity of these nation-building efforts under Putin is notable, this is not a new phenomenon. In fact, contemporary patriotic culture builds on both pre-revolutionary and Soviet precedents. And so nostalgia also plays a role in constructing these affective attachments. And I need to do more thinking about nostalgia, thinking through Svetlana Boym and others as we kind of think through the nostalgia. Okay, I'm going to start my PowerPoint now. All righty. Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. So Putin-era patriotic culture is often centered on war memory and produces emotional responses through time displacements. And I'm going to talk about, I really want to focus on both ways of the time displacement, but I'm going to very briefly talk about the one way. which is this is the dual phenomenon of bringing the past into the present and the present into the past. For example, the raw emotion of the Immortal Regiment Parade, the so-called People's section of the May 9th Victory Day Parade, is produced by the idea that the now deceased veterans of the Second World War are once again alive and marching with their families through the streets. The use of the word immortal is here no accident, as the parade metaphorically resurrects the dead and reunites families as they together celebrate the great victory in the Second World War in the present moment. This parade metaphorically stops time, as the vast majority of the pictures carried on the placards are of vigorous young men and women frozen in time at the precise moment of their heroic efforts in World War II. The parade also brings the past into the present so that the long deceased veterans have the ability to take their rightful places of honor as the parade progresses through space. This familial joy is mixed with solemn commemoration of the sacrifices of the veterans, and of course tinged with sadness that most of the veterans are no longer among the living, or they're too frail to march in the parade. The act of defying time as a whole community makes the parade an emotionally powerful event. So this is bringing the past into the present. Here's another past into the present that's a little scarier. This is a vivid hologram of Joseph Stalin at the Victory Museum in Moscow, the newly named Victory Museum. It used to be the Central Museum of the Great War of the Fatherland. Since 2017, it's the Victory Museum. There's a series of 4 holograms depicting Stalin and his advisors making important wartime decisions. And the viewer experiences the collapsing of time, being confronted in the present with a 3D image of Stalin, moving image of Stalin. The museum's decision to exploit advanced technology in order to return Stalin to life is an interesting one that says a great deal about the ambiguous position of Stalin in contemporary Russia. Putin's decision to elevate the victory as the most important event in Russian history has necessitated at least a partial rehabilitation of Stalin as the engineer of the victory. And so the museum's curators chose to engage viewers with heroic and technologically advanced visions of Stalin as a leader. Whether this brings joy to viewers or a titillating thrill of a horror movie is harder to discern. I think I'm going to take you off Stalin for a minute. I'll put you on the next thing. The 3-dimensional dioramas that I want to focus on today move people through time in the opposite direction. So those 2 things are bringing the past into the present. Now I want to bring people from the present back into the past, right? This is this is where temporality comes in. This is time going the other direction. They allow people to step into the past. In an important 2016 article, Jeffrey Brooks and Boris Dreylyuk emphasize new forms of history at play, such as video games and large-scale historical reenactments. They write, historical play allows individuals to participate imaginatively in the great conflicts and the dramas of the past, testing themselves and examining their agency in a realm free of existential consequences and often infused with humor. Although the dioramas, the panoramas are not humorous at all, I don't think. The other forms are maybe more humorous. They argue that this sense of play evokes Bakhtin's carnival, with its utopian challenges to authority and the egalitarian participation of all the population. While Brooks and Dreylyuk emphasize the management of risk in an uncertain society, I'd like to focus on historical play as producing moments of wonder, of pleasure, and the carnivalesque and free notion of reversing time or being outside of normal time, as stepping into a different time. So this is why these things are so appealing, or at least that's my kind of hypothesis, right? I haven't done the reception research, which I'd love to do, and I have to kind of figure out how to do that. Okay, so 3-dimensional war panoramas are all the rage in Russia at the moment. The workshop of St. Petersburg artists, that it's called Nevsky Batalist, and it is supported by a grant from the president of the Russian Federation for the Development of Civil Society. And in the last 7 years, they have produced 17 different panoramas depicting battle scenes from the Second World War. These include a Train of Victory, which is an immersive traveling exhibition, which reminds me, anybody who, I'm a longtime student of Soviet propaganda, and this reminds me of the Soviet agit trains of the Civil War era in 1918 to 21. So imagine this traveling train exhibit, going around Russia. The verbiage, the webpage explains that the 3-dimensional panorama, and this is their translation, which is quite clunky, but I thought I'd leave them their translation, It's an exhibition complex, which combines a wide format image of a terrain, a landscape with a circular view and a subject plane, originals or full-size models, complemented by sound and light effects. Unlike at classical panoramas and dioramas, the viewer observes the recreated picture not from the side, but from the inside. In fact, you could walk through these things. The emphasis is not on painted canvas, but on a subject plane, sculptures of heroes. So it makes the viewer become a witness of a frozen moment. Okay. So I want to stop a minute here to deal with the past, right? To deal with this question of what is a classical panorama or diorama, right? Because this is just infused with Soviet nostalgia and actually even pre-revolutionary nostalgia. So the most famous, I hope everyone knows that if you're thinking about dioramas in Moscow, the most famous one is this one, the Borodino battle diorama. Right? And I don't know if it's a diorama or panorama. It's a painting, but there are some 3D things in it. This is a shot that captures it. If you're so close that it almost looks like it's real, but you're standing on the platform. This one, the original painting dates back to 1912. Right? It's a pre-revolutionary painting that was commissioned by Nicholas II to commemorate the centennial of the Borodino battle of 1812, right, of course. And the painter is an Odessa-born, French-speaking, Munich-trained artist by the name of Franz Roubaud. And this panorama survived despite being politically incorrect. After the Russian Revolution, it got stored away and half, destroyed. But they lovingly restored it for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Borodino in 1962. Right, so it became a kind of Soviet era, sort of restoration, and it remains on display to this day. And so I'm going to show you another picture, which is this gives you a better sense of what it looks like. You're standing on this, and look at this. This is a brand new platform, right? And it's circular, and so the battle is 360 degrees around you, and you walk around the platform in the middle. And they just restored it, and they just restored it again, and did new, updated for safety and ventilation and whatnot. So so they're clearly putting a lot of time, money, and effort into this. So I'm struck by the 20th century survival of the panorama, right? It's a 19th century form, and it was created, mostly it was from the 1880s, right? It was, this is like the hottest thing in 1880 was to have one of these circular panoramas. And they were often German-trained painters who went around the world and did these panoramas. In the United States, they were particularly popular in the 1880s, depicting Civil War battle scenes. There's a really famous one in Atlanta. If you ever are interested in seeing one of these in real life, there's one in the Atlanta Museum, of course, the battle for, of a Civil War battle. And what's strange to me is that this phenomenon, which really by the time even this painting was painted in 1912 was on its way out due to the advent of cinema, has nonetheless become the sort of is still a 21st century, really, it's being revived in the 21st century as this, sort of popular medium of helping people to, grasp happiness playing at war, right? It's really, to me, the antiquated part of it and the nostalgia part of it are really an integral part. But of course, it's been updated dramatically, even from 1962, which is when, this one was done. Okay. And so I think, what the diorama has, and I'll move on here. There are a couple that I will feature today. I have tons more pictures, but we only have a short amount of time, and I don't want to overburden you with tons of pictures. But the thing that the diorama or the panorama has over film is that it's a physically immersive experience as the viewer steps inside the panorama and outside of everyday time and back into the past. And so this time-traveling immersive aspect has allowed the panorama to maintain its popularity despite the advent of much more technically sophisticated ways of simulating reality, like virtual reality glasses, right? I mean, there are way more technically sophisticated ways of doing this. These displays are often housed in history museums, which have a much more kind of two-dimensional, sometimes they have objects, but they're objects behind glass. And so they often stand out as the most vivid and engaging of the museum's exhibits when they're in a history museum. And it's also clear that they're meant to appeal to children, right? That that this is a children's sense of play as part of their patriotic education. Though I think that this sort of element of play extends to adults as well. I don't think it's just children that are sort of meant to be engaged by these things. Okay, so I'm going to show you. This is the panorama is the Moscow 1941, the counterattack. And it's supposed to take place in December. It has actually a specific date, right? That gives you every one of these things has a it has some written explanation of exactly what you're seeing, right, on the back wall. And this one is these are the events that take place from between December 20th and December 24th of 1941, when the Soviets were able to stop the Nazi onslaught and save Moscow, right? So this is a very famous sort of battle in World War II, a very important battle in World War II, and that's what we get to see. And this one happens to be in the Russia My History Museum, which is, again, this like layers of nostalgia. The Russia My History Museum is a 21st century museum, but it is located in the newly restored VDNK, which is a Soviet sort of amusement park exhibition center, the exhibition of national economic achievements. And so it's got layers of Soviet and post-Soviet sort of pedigree there. And it is sponsored by Nevsky Battalist, by the Russia My History Museum, and also the Поисковое движение России, which is an organization that still goes out into the forest to find corpses of World War II bodies and bury them properly. So it really has a kind of sort of broad, a real element to it too, or at least in terms of its sponsorship. Okay, so the artist chose to begin in a German warehouse that was located inside of a ruined Orthodox church. And I think this reflects the new sort of position of the Orthodox Church in Russia, that orthodoxy is something that is sort of back into the public discourse. While there's a lot of nostalgia for Soviet stuff, one thing that's added to that is a layer of Russian orthodoxy that was not in the Soviet displays, right? There's not Russian orthodoxy in the Soviet panoramas, but it's added in very explicitly into these. The artists are very talented, and so they try to recreate a variety of scenes in each panorama. So they have indoor scenes, they have street scenes. Here's a street scene, and what's notable here is the German marking, letting everybody know that Moscow is in 124 kilometers. And again, what's titillating here is that we know that the Germans threatened to get to Moscow, but they didn't get to Moscow. So we know that sign is not fulfilled, and that gives it a special sort of excitement. Here's a slightly wider view to kind of give you a feeling for what it looks like as you're walking through. So there are obviously different scenes of this battle in Ivanovskaya, but it's you can sort of see that they're side by side, and you have to kind of intersperse yourself into the pictures. You are allowed to touch the exhibits. They say explicitly you can touch them. So it's you're meant to be inside them. You're meant to touch them. They're meant to be tactile, visual, and there's sound effects, of course. And and then they're dealing with the nitty-gritty of battle. These are specific people with specific guns in a specific place. In some cases, they even mention who's manning the gun, right? So it's immersive, and it captures the weather and the lighting and all of these things. Here you can see sort of obviously in that burning tank, there's there's battle going on, there's violence happening, but it's only implied violence, right? Although apparently the more recent ones are even more graphic than these. Here you can kind of see people trying to kill each other, but there's not a lot of there's a guy killing right in the back there, right? But you're not really seeing a lot of you're not getting gore in these. Okay, I'm sorry, there we go. And so this is another one that's in Kaliningrad Oblast Museum. And I can tell you it's the most exciting thing in the Kaliningrad Oblast Museum, no question. Here I wanted to show you this is a picture taken by the Getty in the Getty images of the opening, where you have that clash of the past and the present, because in fact here's a real veteran of the event. That is the governor of that's the acting governor of Kaliningrad region, Anton Alekhanov, and war veteran Ivan Tikhonov. And they don't bother to mention that there's also a young sort of person engaging in their patriotic education in uniform there. That person doesn't get captioned in the picture, so I don't know who that is. But clearly there's a young woman in a kind of military style patriotic education uniform there as well, which I think is very relevant. And they're walking through this diorama that's in Kaliningrad. So to conclude, right, I don't have a lot of time here. What to make of these things, right? These are representations of war that are sanitized. You can see injured people and even dying people, but you can't hear their screams or smell the smoke or smell the dead bodies. So it's, on some level, it's a fairy tale or amusement park version of war, which I find very dangerous in its, in its both appeal and its sanitization of anything that actually is really about war. So it's patriotic culture through the invitation to imaginative play, turning the tragedy of war into a sanitized play set for imaginative play and time travel, an attempt to inject happiness and pleasure, play and carnivalesque elements of being a participant, not a spectator, and being outside of regular time. But you're being inserted into a narrative of tragedy while you're having a good time. Right? I mean, it's you're playing, and but nonetheless, this is a narrative of tragedy, and we can see there is a dead body right here, right? So it's not as if death isn't there, but it's nonetheless presented in a way that is I don't know, somehow appealing, right? Yeah, you to be walking alongside of a dead body. I think if I were really walking alongside a dead body, I'd be pretty upset, right? And not happy. But so that's this weird twist of this. I think it's multi-generational nostalgic appeal. It's Soviet, it's post-Soviet, it's revolutionary, it's got Russian Orthodoxy, it's got a little bit of something for everybody. Attracting parents and grandparents with Soviet-style entertainment, children with this really interesting immersive environment, and inviting everybody to play. And so I'll leave there, but because I don't quite know what to, other than, noting that this is a way of making war appealing. I want to think through more, and, thinking through how it works. I want to think through a little bit better. Is it working, right? Does this work? And I don't know the answer to that yet. And so we can think about that further. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, sorry, I need to stop sharing the screen. There we go.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to react immediately. I'm kind of like, ugh, okay, you are right. This seems very disturbing, right? That somehow the war experience is being turned into fairly attractive entertainment. And you have been, I guess, to the new Gulag Museum in Russia, in Moscow.
So I've been to the Gulag Museum, but not very recently. I think last time I was there was 2016.
I was very struck by this museum that again was explicitly funded and kind of, by Putin or by the president. And it's also just eerily entertaining. Which I think is, so I think this phenomenon it can expand in like just almost unfathomable directions. But I'm wondering, does it work? So my kind of first question that kind of very much, your presentation and Hannah's just worked together so well is, so Hannah and I guess Karen, is as you said, so the dioramas and all this stuff, right, appeals to children, appeals to, by the way, American students that are in Russia being taken to museums, and they're like, whoa, these museums are more fun than we thought, right? And is it not then also going to primarily appeal to what Hannah calls the the political unsophisticates or non-sophisticates. So the same the same audience for whom the Putin's thing timeline, or what was it, seems to be working, right? Direct line, sorry. The same audience that is going to respond in a positive way on your graph to direct line would presumably be kind of the demographic that on whom these diorama things are going to, as you say, work, right? So I guess that would be a kind of a question for both of you. Are in some ways, is Putin's efforts at the direct line and this diorama phenomenon and the larger phenomenon, are these in fact in some ways like they're targeting the same audience, or they're working on the same audience? And then the other question, of course, will be for us, are they going to repel equally the political sophisticates, right? So that might be I guess one question. I guess how do we want to do this? I could pause and let you two respond to that and then turn to Smokey's slightly different questions I have for her.
Hannah, do you want to go
So that
first?
sounds good. And we have, I think, about 20 minutes, so we may also be getting some questions from the audience.
Oh, yeah.
So let's.
Okay.
Sure, I'll go ahead. So I was really struck, Karen, by essentially you saying that what these do is that they allow people to become participants, right? Not just spectators. And this is definitely, I think, what we're seeing in the direct line, is that it's not just people sitting back and observing these things that the government is creating, but it's rather giving them the opportunity to almost be co-constructors of the message itself, right? And I think that is kind of really the important aspect of the direct line that is having this effect on individuals, is this kind of back and forth so that they can actually be part of the conversation. I don't want to speak to if I think that for Karen's examples, if they are working for just the more politically unsophisticated. My guess would be, just from my own research, perhaps, but I'm interested in, Karen, in your response. Who do you think this is really appealing to?
I think that's really a very interesting question. And I agree with Yvonne that probably when it comes to the adult audience, that we're talking about the same, it's the same group of people who Hannah's describing as the already politically inclined or less sophisticated. But I wonder about the children, right? I mean, the children of the sophisticated, the children of the resistors are also being exposed to this stuff. And I wonder if it isn't a kind of attempt to sort of to make the next generation more engaged, even if this generation even if their parents are wary, right? I mean, I honestly, I have no evidence, right? This is this is an interpretive framework, but because they do seem to be so appealing to children and young students and teenagers, in particular teenage boys, probably, right? Or male children and teenage boys. I do wonder if there isn't. I think there's a huge gender component, by the way, which I didn't talk about. But I think maybe what we're seeing is a kind of an approach that is trying to reach the generation before they turn into skeptics, right? And so that's how I would that's how I would answer that question, as hypothetically, right? I don't have good evidence for this, but that's what I'm thinking.
Okay, so according to my own theory that I started to kind of work out last night, the idea would be that this, even for these younger children or teenage boys or whoever, the kind of happiness that they're engaging in when they get to kind of like feel like, I don't know, they're shooting it up, or they're in that scene, that gaminess of it, right? The game thing that Hannah's talking about is still buying into a kind of collective form of happiness. Your happiness comes from being part of, ooh, we're all on the same side, we're going to beat the bad guys. Whereas presumably as one matures, and this is, Smokey, you were talking about this real generational thing about the more hipster, right? That new generation that presumably is starting to kind of think, what about my own individual, quirky, unique kind of right to my own, to some kind of happiness the way I see it, and not being part of the church and part of the good guys, or part of the club. But I mean, honestly, in any society, I mean, that's the people fall on a whole range of real desire and comfort zone in being part of a collective, and those who are, or kind of have that different kind of psychology that's going to thrive on kind of, I don't know, seeking one's own path. And I'm sure political scientists can show that those two types of people break up into different kind of tendencies and so forth. Let me see. I wonder, does Alicia have to do our Q&A thing? I'm pretty sure the audience is going to have a ton of questions, so I kind of want people to be able to raise their hand or go to the Q&A.
I can go over.
Lisa, go ahead.
Like, okay, perfect. All right, give me 1 second to bring this up. Come on now. Sorry. Okay. All right, so if you were here for our keynote last night, you've probably seen my spiel at this point, but I just want to go over briefly how we're going to take questions for today's panel. So we're going to be using the Q&A feature and the raise hand feature. You can feel free to use either, but you will find the raise hand and Q&A icons at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The way that we will be using the raise hand feature is we will be looking for raised hands in the order that we see them. And as we see them, we'll allow people to unmute themselves and ask their question aloud. Just as a quick note, you will be asked to unmute yourself. You'll be prompted by Zoom to do that. And you will briefly appear on the screen. But after that, we will mute you and remove your talking permissions, and then you'll go off the screen. And then the next way that we will take questions is using the Q&A feature. And I'm sure a lot of you probably are familiar with this feature, but if you click the Q&A icon, you'll just be able to type in your question into the box and submit it that way, and that will show up on our end, and we'll answer those as we get them as well. Additionally, you're able to ask questions anonymously if you like, and you can do that by checking the Ask Anonymously checkbox at the very bottom left-hand corner of that pop-up window. Okay, and that's about it for Q&A.
Great. Well, we'd love to have some questions, and maybe Smokey, you want to answer something that Yvonne asked related to this question of generations while we're waiting?
Sure. I want to say actually that it's very interesting, the discussion about museums, and it's a very, very vibrant discussion in Albania as well. There's been museums about the Secret Service and about sort of the really dark side of communism. There's actually one that's it's sort of like about these underground bunker, like a huge bunker, right? So the concrete connects with that too. But the interesting thing, so what I've seen in Albania, and it sounds to me like maybe this is something to think about, is that I'm seeing a polarization, a radical polarization, and sometimes it cuts across generations, sometimes it doesn't. But on one side, we have similar efforts to try to remember the communist times. I think people still don't know how to remember the sort of positive sides of communism. There's a lot of tension around that. And then there is also people who just want to remember communism as the Holocaust, right? So this very polarized things. And with the young generation, what I find is interesting, again, even the young generation, I think, is split, because there's a young generation who did not grow up in communism at all, but has a certain fascination with it because it was a system that had some sort of stability and had some future. So that's one part. And then, so that generation is interested in learning about like the communal things, you know, the activist communal things, or the, you know, volunteer work in the fields. But then I think one of the other things I was going to mention about these dioramas of the battles remind me of communist propaganda in Albania, which was all, you know, films about the Second World War as a way to reconstitute the community, right? So anyway, so there's a lot of parallels, but definitely I think the generations, and I'm sorry, finally, I think that also appeals to older generation. My dad's generation really likes to see get pride thinking about, speaking about the despair that you talked about yesterday. And by contrast to that, people are so tired of feeling that despair of the communist being part of communism, and they want to remember the good things, right? So it's very interesting, but I think there's very contradictory feelings. But I wonder if any of you who was working in Russia sees not only the sort of the top-down line of how we are remembering the past, but also how people are perhaps contesting those narratives as well.
So so Michael Kramer is raising his hand, and I'm gonna if we could unmute Michael, and then we have 2 or 3 already typed questions in Q&A. So we'll go from Michael to the Q&As.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talks. I really enjoyed all of them. So I had a question for Dr. Patron. I was curious, you had that great image of the World War II veteran at the Panorama. Have there been any statements from these veterans about what they think about these panoramas, or if not about the panoramas, about generally other sort of the contemporary celebrations of war? I mean, because you have this whole sort of invented story happening with war memory, what do the actual participants think about these invented stories? And thanks again, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. Nice to hear you. Nice to hear from you. So I guess that's a really good question. I mean, I think you suggested a really good, I'm working on sort of doing some of the basic research here. And I think you're so hit something very important, which is, how the veterans are roped into this, right? I mean, so I am imagining that there's going to be at least some subset of veterans that are engaging in this because it gives them attention and honor. They're being, they're being invoked in this. But I think you're right. That would be very interesting to see if there are contesting voices among the veterans, and that would be well worth kind of looking for, trying to figure out who might be speaking on behalf of the veterans in a more in a contesting voice, in a voice that's saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, sort of playing at war. And so that is something that I would like to see. I definitely think that they're trying to co-opt the veterans, but whether it succeeds is, again, this is where I have to do more research and kind of finding those voices who are going against the grain. So thank you very much for that question. It's a great idea to look for that.
So in our Q&A, there's 2 questions that are very, very similar. So I'm going to try to merge them. It's cool. So Ep is asking, this is a question about the ethics of happiness. Is happiness as a collective feeling necessarily connected to manipulation and covering over actual problems in society? And in a kind of a similar vein, I think Theodora is asking, I wonder if all of you could elaborate on your takes on happiness, as in political reality shows, urban renewal projects, and patriotic dioramas all seek to evoke emotional reactions. So I am very interested in how we think about the role of emotions in public projects. Well, okay, so one is more, yes, about the emotions of public projects, and one is kind of about this ethics of, like, is collective feeling necessarily connected to manipulation and covering? Yeah, good question. So I think for all 3 of you.
I can go first, since I talk explicitly about manipulation. So we as political scientists, we're a big fan of the concept of information manipulation. I think it has a negative connotation that it's not necessarily supposed to have. I personally prefer the term management instead. And so I think we need to be careful at ascribing intent to leaders. I don't have a direct line to the brains of Peskov or Putin or what have you. So we have to look basically at their actions. Things like the direct line are incredibly managed shows, for as I talk about in the presentation, right? People submit millions of questions over the course of a number of weeks, but it is the organizers themselves that are the ones that are actually curating these questions and actually presenting a certain type of a message that is in line with what the government wants to promote, right? So I do think that there is quite a bit of evidence for this idea of management. This is not something that the government is just doing for fun. It has to have some relation to essentially what their intent is. So to the question of what do I think of, this idea of collective versus individual happiness, I really am looking at pretty much satisfaction, right? With how do people view not only their leaders, but their own sense of efficacy, of their own sense of in the political process. What is their place here? And I see here the purpose and what we're seeing in the results here is that for some of these people, it really does seem to be conditioning them to think of themselves as an actual co-constructor of the political message, as a person who is able to interact directly with the government, which, as we see, do indeed appear to be increasing satisfaction and approval for some individuals.
I can also speak to that. There's two things that I want to say. So for one thing, for a long time in the 90s and 2000s, Albanians would not want to speak positively about communism, right? And there was this aversion to thinking about the collective happiness because it was associated with parades and with these communist rituals that Karen talked about. And so I feel like there was this sort of emotional I'm speaking also to Theodora's question in terms of collective emotions, that you almost weren't allowed to be sort of collectively happy because it sort of evoked the sense of manipulation that we were talking about. So at the same time, the construction projects, which I'm focusing on, in some ways are, especially since the 2000s. So again, in the first decade of post-socialism, there weren't a lot of sort of government projects that were, except for building roads, that would have any sort of message or collective emotion. But the ones that have been happening the last 20 years, they're all tapping on these emotions, and they're all trying to restore a sense of pride in the nation, pride in the culture. And so it's really difficult to, I think that both top down and bottom up, people are sort of dancing around emotion. So how to evoke pride in the nation, but not repeat the communist type of propaganda. Now, that said, the opposition party and people who are critical to these sort of state-led kinds of projects and designs, the redesign of the public square or building of these new towers, they all accuse the current government of repeating the past, of being like the communists, in how they're sort of portraying, for instance, these towers as the Mediterranean future or the European future. I don't know if that helps to address that question, but definitely emotions are really important in how these projects are being cast. But at the same time, they're met with a lot of skepticism from people on the ground.
Okay, so there's a question about how long, a very quick question to answer, how long people actually stay in these exhibits. I'll try and address that one. My sense is that somebody who's not playing will be there for 10 or 15 minutes, but I could easily see, a parent and some children, sort of staying there for longer and kind of engaging as as play, right? So, but a normal adult visit would probably be 10, 15 minutes. In terms of the collective, I do think that that collective happiness doesn't necessarily have to be manipulated or managed. But in these cases, it seems to me that and I'm looking at a very particular kind of patriotic culture where really their management is the key. But I don't think it necessarily has to be. But the Immortal Regiment started out in 2013 on the other side of the spectrum, on that kind of individual side of the spectrum. And it was basically taken over by Kremlin authorities when they saw how popular it was, right? So it was created in Tomsk in 2013 by a journalist, who was trying to, sort of regain some of the authenticity of celebration, and then it gets taken over. And so when it's taken over, it's obviously being manipulated. So I think these things are, it doesn't necessarily have to be. And in fact, the origins of the Immortal Regiment were not manipulated until they were taken over.
Smokey, do you want to answer this question from Adriana Kovachova?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Adriana. So the question is, what are the differences between the urban and rural areas in Albania as far as Betonism is concerned? Is the problem with the memory of communist modernism in architecture limited strictly to city dwellers? So one thing to know is that in the last 30 years, there's been a lot of internal migration in Albania, and a lot of people have actually moved to the city. So 2/3 of the population lives in cities now. So that's an important factor. At the same time, I'm glad you brought up this question, because I've focused my presentation on these cities and on projects that are sort of construction projects in the cities. But there's been a lot of construction in the rural areas as well, but it's mostly individual construction, self-built homes. So interestingly, this is a little bit unrelated to your question, but concrete is very present in the rural areas in so far as the people who are building their own houses are using concrete, right? So there is that proliferation of concrete in the rural areas as well. But the anti-Betonism campaigns really just focus on the cities, because the cities have really intensified. So what has happened, and this is different from some of the other Eastern European cities, is that people have built within the city because everyone wants to be downtown, right? So there's been spread, but there's been a lot. When I mentioned the intensification of the city, it really, that first image that I showed, it's building where there used to be playgrounds, where there used to be the spaces within the communist apartment buildings, there is a new high rise, right? So that's the kind of the building that people are against at. So the problem with the memory of communist modernism, the interesting thing about that is I actually got conflicting views on the communist modernism. So yes, I focused more on the disillusionment with that, and concrete apartment buildings are not great to live in. But a lot of people have had problems with the new buildings. So some of the concrete panel buildings have resisted the weather better than some of the post-90s buildings. So anyway, so some people, for instance, in Saranda, they really looked at these communist buildings as being more structured and ordered and having what they call, they had a plan. There was a plan for the city, whereas the new construction is built outside of any plan, right? So that's where that's where we find this conflicting emotions towards communist architecture, because there's a sort of nostalgia. And I say this in the bigger chapter, it's not nostalgia. People don't want to go back. Let's just make that clear. People don't want to go back to the communist times, but there is a nostalgia for the sense of order and plan that doesn't seem to exist anymore.
Great, yeah. So I was going to go back to this question from Heidi Golding, who's asking another question of Karen. She says that your presentation brought to mind a quote from Vietnam Memory Studies book on the war in Vietnam. The problem of war and memory is therefore first and foremost about how to remember the dead who cannot speak for themselves. Do you know of any adverse reactions to the panoramas from those that lived through the war? I'm wondering if survivors feel betrayed by the sanitized nature of the panoramas, or maybe they feel represented and happy that others are interested in their experiences. And I want to point out, so there's so much work going on that's so interesting now. We're practically in the era of post-memory though, right? Our veterans are really old. I'm thinking of the veteran that I saw trotted out at an event outside of an event in Vyazma, who really, you know, it was his job and he went and he did it and he went back and he wasn't really paying attention to what was happening. He was just doing his job as a 92-year-old or whatever. So it's interesting to what extent we can still access this information.
Yeah, that's, and in fact, I wrote privately. I didn't think we would get to the questions. I wrote privately to Heidi, and I've said something along the line. I mean, think about it. The youngest child survivors who might be able to remember anything are at least 85. Right. So we're talking about, you know, the folks who actually fought in the war are all approaching 100. Right. And, you know, how many are left. Right. So I do think we're close to that post-memory era. And therefore, it's hard to know whether, I mean, I need to do research to find this out, whether there is a small set of veterans who are still publicly active in that, in a real in a dialogic way, and not just trotted out at, you know, at events with all their medals on, right? You know, sort of, are there veterans who are really engaging with this, as opposed to playing certain roles, you know, because they no longer really have the capacity to be fully engaged. And so I think the ones that must be a very tiny number, we really are almost at post-memory.
This has just been a really terrific, and I know I'm trying to see how many people we have left. I think our questions have petered out. Maybe it's time to go to lunch. I want to thank everybody for this amazing panel. I really think it did come together well. It's super interesting, super talented scholars here. And I want to also remind everyone that we have some panels, sort of Zoom rooms starting at 1. If you want to pop into a Zoom room, there will be sort of breakout sessions to talk about the different topics. I know some people have classroom obligations or other kinds of things, so please do come to the conference tomorrow, come to the Midwest Slavic meeting this evening, come to the student events. If you're a student, we want to welcome you and welcome your participation. I think this has been a great start this morning. If anyone has any other comments, otherwise we can wrap up and go try to get some lunch before the next events.
Thank you so much, everyone. Wonderful talks.
Thank you for
Thank you.